All right, let's talk about how to organize values. I see students getting lost with values all the time, and it can be a very frustrating and confusing aspect of drawing. The solution is to have a clear process to navigate the complexity that we often encounter. At Barcelona Academy of Art, where I teach, every student who does a long pose figure drawing or a cast drawing or any similar project creates a value study as a preparation to shading. A value study is a small drawing in which you analyze the values and organize them into 3 to 5 value groups. You can see the groups on the bottom of this image and the corresponding numbers indicated in the drawing. The technique that we use in the value study is called value grouping, and in this lesson I will show you how to do value grouping with any subject matter. In my mind, we have two options. If the subject is very simple, the best approach is usually to use light logic to create your value groups. This means thinking about modeling factors and separating light and shadow, adding dark halftones and so forth. If the subject is more complex, it makes sense to simply group similar values together, regardless of modeling factors. Let's do light logic first. Here are the steps of drawing a plaster cast, which is a copy of a sculpture. We begin with a line drawing to get the proportions right. At this point, you have two values, the paper and the drawing. Next is the value study, where we use 3 to 4 value groups. On a figure drawing, you might go up to 5 groups. Next is the shading stage, where we expand to using the full value range. So the value study is a preparation for shading, so you know where you're going in terms of values. Let's focus on the value study using light logic. On this ball, you can see all the modeling factors, and they create a lot of complexity in value. How do we make this simple? How can we organize these values? By working from big to small. The biggest distinction we can make is to separate light from shadow. This gives us two value groups, the light family and the shadow family. Then we subdivide the light family into dark halftones and light halftones. Dark halftones are those that are close to the terminator. We now have 3 value groups. Let's compare this to the original image. These value groups give us a good starting point, but we're missing a few things in our simplification. The shadow family consists of at least 3 things: the reflected light, core shadow, and cast shadow. If we could only add one of these to our value groups, which one would you choose? Would you add the core shadow? Would you add the reflected light? Or would you add the cast shadow? I would use the cast shadow because the contrast between the cast shadow and the rest of the image is bigger than the contrast between any of the other elements. If you squint, they're pretty much unified. So we can group core shadow and reflected light into one value group, which we can call form shadow. And then last group will be the cast shadow. That gives us 4 value groups to explain the whole sphere here. Now let's do a value grouping for a slightly more complex object, like this plaster cast. Again, we begin by separating light and shadow, and you can see those indicated on the image. Then we add the dark halftones, and next we add the tone that stands out most. In this case, that is also the cast shadow, so that's becoming its own value group. I thought it could be fun to do a value study together, so I'm going to take this image and show you the whole process step by step. Let's switch to Photoshop. I begin with a line drawing, always starting with top, bottom, left, and right, and then adding the big shapes. This is just a basic block-in, and proportions really don't matter that much with the value study. It's all about the relationships between value groups. I'm going to speed this up a bit to save you some time. And here we go. This is the line drawing for establishing basic shapes. Now, we begin by separating light and shadow. So we have the light already, that's the paper value, and I'm going to add a value for the shadows. This is an average value for the shadows, and I have one tone available, in the whole drawing to represent my shadow family. Again, I'll speed it up a bit. And as you see, because there's only one value, we are combining form shadow and cast shadow for now. Next, we add the dark halftones. And again, I'm choosing an average value to represent the dark halftones throughout this image. And I'm fiddling with it for a moment until I'm happy. And then I apply this value everywhere where I think it should be. I'm ignoring very small halftone shapes because what I'm after is the general impression of the whole image. And actually, deciding where to place these value groups is almost like doing the drawing already once. So when you're going back to the actual artwork, it's like you've done it already. So it's super helpful. Okay, then a big part that's missing right now is the background. And we could add another value group for the background, but what would be much, much better is to use one of our existing groups. The background is pretty close, either to the halftone value or to the shadow value. And the halftone value looks a bit too light. So I'm going with the shadow value here to represent my background. Now, as you may notice, we're losing the distinction between cast shadow and the rest of the background. And the first time you do that, it's a little bit scary, but don't worry about it. Just simplify. You'll find that shape again later. And actually, the simplification helps you to see the overall image in a simpler way. And with the background in, we can also definitely tell that we need another value group to represent the cast shadow. And I'm putting an average value for the cast shadow here, and I'm noticing that my shadow value is too light. And this is a natural part of doing a value study. You will find yourself throughout the process adjusting the relationships between the values or adjusting individual groups to make them a bit lighter or a bit darker. In this case, I'm going to darken my shadow value group actually quite a bit, so that when I add the cast shadow, those two are in a pretty good relationship. The contrast between them should be pretty much the same as what I see on the image on the left. Okay, and having adjusted my shadow value, I'm also going to make my dark halftones a bit darker. And then the final thing we could do is to make that shadow shape to the left of the nose a little bit lighter and actually group it with the halftones. And this is controversial a little bit because some people are purists and they say shadow should always be shadow. And I agree with that most of the time. But sometimes it does make sense, in my opinion, to group very light shadows that have a lot of reflected light with the value group that represents the dark halftones. Okay, that's it. This is a value study, and this is how you make a value study. Now let's do something a bit more complex, like this painting by Velázquez. As soon as we're dealing with multiple local values, we can't use light logic to make value groups. For example, if you look at the coat of the figure on the right, the light halftones of the fabric are much darker than the light halftones of the skin of the main figure. So the way to go about this is to look for values that are similar to each other, regardless of light logic. First, let's remove the color information, so we're just dealing with tonal values. Then I'm going to simplify this image. I'll show you how to do this in a moment. But as I eliminate detail, you could begin to see the general impression of the image. This is called the effect. It's an extremely useful idea in drawing and painting, and I think that you can't really compose if you can't see the effect of your work. You can't really make good decisions about composition if you can't see the big picture, if you can't feel the entire image at once. This is Andrew Loomis using the effect in a portrait. First, he establishes the big tonal relationships as a foundation, and then he adds the details within that big context. It's a very effective way of working. And here, Loomis again, studying the effect of more complex compositions. When you're doing a value study, you are going for the effect. Your value study should feel like your subject. When you compare the two, there should be no big difference between them. Let's make a value study of this painting. To begin, I'll remove the color with a black and white adjustment layer. The nice thing about this is that you can tweak the values based on the hue of the image. So if you want to make small adjustments, you can. Next, I press Ctrl J to make a copy of this layer. Then I press the C key for the crop tool to extend the canvas. And now I can move the copy I made over to the right. Alright, now I want to show you how I simplify the image. So go to Filter, Noise, Median. The median filter is amazing. So the higher the radius value is here, the more details are absorbed into the big shapes. Next, I go to Filter, Stylize, and Find Edges, just to give me a general drawing of where the shapes are roughly. And I do this here to save you time, but you can also do this yourself to really focus just on the values and not be distracted by the drawing. Then I make a levels adjustment to make the lines a bit lighter. You can press Ctrl L or Command L for the levels adjustment. And finally, I'll make a new layer, fill it with kind of an average tone for the image, and set my line layer to multiply. And this is my setup. I'm going to paint on this layer, lock transparency so any mark I make stays within that area, and we're ready to go. I begin a value study like this by keying the image. That means identifying the darkest value, which are the pants here, and the lightest value, which is in the skin and on the fabric that's on his lap there. So I put those values in to give me context, because any value group I add should be in a good, proper relationship to these two extremes. Next, I look at the image and I try to see the effect, the essence visually. And I'm looking for values that are present throughout the image that I want to add next. So here I'm going for the tone of the clothing of the kneeling figure. And I'm rearranging my palette here to go from light to dark. The next group I want to add is this figure on the top right. That dark value is present throughout the image, so I think that's going to be an important one. And right now it looks pretty close to black, but if we paint them next to each other, you can see there's a clear difference between them. If we use black for what I'm painting now, there would be too much contrast. The relationship between my value groups would be off. The effect of my value study would feel wrong. Now we have 4 value groups. We probably will end up with 5, but now I'm adding those 4 groups throughout the image where I can find them, starting with any of them really. Here I'm starting with the lightest. And I'm careful not to add it in places where it doesn't belong. So I'm a little bit conservative with where I put these values. And I just realized we actually already have 5 value groups because there's the background. So let's rearrange the palette again and add a swatch for the background value. And looking at this now, I realize that this value is too light. We should go darker for the average tone. So I'm going to select color range, pick that background value, and then we can do a levels adjustment. Or what feels a bit more direct in this case is to do a hue saturation adjustment and changing the lightness value. Okay, I think the effect of the image just got a lot better by adjusting that value group. Here I'm darkening those lines a bit so we can see them better, just to help me with placing things. And from here on, basically all that I'm doing is applying those 5 value groups that I've chosen to the value study. It's like painting by numbers. I'm filling the canvas with that limited palette that I gave myself. And as I do this, I'm always staying aware of checking the relationship between the value groups. And if one of my groups seems too dark or too light, not a problem. I adjust the brightness of that group, both in my palette and in the value study. What I'm after is organizing all those many, many tones that are in the original painting, but representing them in a simple way. And again, I'm going to speed this up for a bit to save you some time. There's nothing skipped, it's just playing back faster. And I'm making an effort to leave out details to just get the general effect of things, like the fabric on the lap of the main character. There's so much going on in there, in the folds, but it's not important. Now I have 5 values, and I just want to cover the whole canvas and understand and capture the essence of the values. And I hope you see that this is pretty simple. You can apply this process to any image. And I believe that 3 to 5 values are enough to clearly communicate any image. So that's pretty powerful. If you start adding more value groups, more than 5, you just have more relationships between groups to juggle. It's just going to be more work, and it's not necessary. So keep it simple. I could keep going and add more small details, but I think this is good enough. We have the essence of the values. The whole image is shown with just 5 groups. And we are going to lose distinctions. For example, on the sitting figure on the left, the hair is darker than the clothing of that figure. In our value study, it's all one thing. We could make that hair black, like the pants are, but I think it would add too much contrast. It would call way more attention to the head of that figure than we actually see in the painting. So the effect would be changed. One more thing. As you get more experience with this, I think it makes sense to introduce the use of gradients in your value studies. Sometimes the hard edges of value groups really break the effect. An example in this image would be the soft transition in the sky. If you decide to use gradients, I would recommend that you do so very sparingly and to make careful decisions about where you put a gradient. If you have too many of them, it defeats the purpose of a value study, which is to get a clear idea of the relationships between the major value groups. Also, I should say that the approach I showed you here is a great way of working, not just for doing a value study, but we could take the sketch that I made right now and take it all the way to a final painting, fully rendered. It's a really effective way of working. All right, now it's your turn to make a value study.